Okay, for those of you who are here on time, it's 8:30. We're just going to wait a minute or two. I see there are still people who are slowly finding their way onto the platform. Tonight's shiur is going to be recorded and it will be posted on the Shul YouTube page. So if there are those of your friends who will not be here tonight, unable to attend, there'll be an opportunity for what we call tashlumin, or making it up. So we'll just wait another minute or two, and then we'll turn the mic over to Rabbi Hoffman. Okay, we're just going to wait one more minute, and then we will begin the shiur tonight. One more minute. Okay. Good evening to everybody. It is our great pleasure to round out our series of introductions to the different Sefarim of the Torah with our distinguished colleague here in Westchester, as has been the theme. We've had different Rabbanim from Westchester give us their insights into the different Sefarim, and it is my great pleasure to welcome from Congregation Anshe Shalom in New Rochelle, Rabbi Evan Hoffman, to teach us tonight about what is Sefer Devarim all about. Rabbi Hoffman.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Klinger, for this opportunity. It's good to be with everybody again. My topic for tonight is Deuteronomy is definitely different. It's a little play on the letter D. Basically, if you read Sefer Devarim with an eye towards how it is consistent with or inconsistent with the first four books of the Torah, and especially Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, you'll immediately notice that there are problematic passages. Even in the first chapter of Devarim, which we're going to read in Shul this Shabbos, you'll notice at least three, if not more, such divergences from the earlier telling of the story. So let's, the first section tonight, if you have the source sheet, look at the first few sources, Devarim Perek Aleph. So we find, Vatikrevun Elai Kulchem. Moshe, in his valedictory address, tells the Israelites, you all approached me, Vatomru, and you said, Nishlecha anashim lefanenu. Send forth people in front of us, v'yachperu lanu et haaretz, and they will scout out the land. V'yashivu otanu davar, and they'll bring back a report at the derech asher na'aleh ba, the path that we should take in our way of conquering the country. So the Deuteronomy version of the story of the Meraglim, of the spies, is that of the people suggesting it to Moshe, and he complies with their wishes. If we go back to Parshat Shlach, what do we find? The very beginning of Parshat Shlach, Vaydaber Hashem Moshe lemor, the classic boilerplate language of the Torah. God speaks to Moses. Shlach lecha anashim, send for yourself, a reconnaissance mission to scout out the land. So was it a divinely ordained decree that this should happen, or was this a request from the people? Now, I'm not here to try to reconcile the the 2 points. The Mefarshim, the classical Mefarshim, will try to do just that, to reconcile the 2 verses. What I'd like to focus on rather is why the Devarim version is what it is, as opposed to the Bamidbar version. And it's perfectly obvious why. Devarim is Musar, is ethical rebuke of the populace by Moshe as he nears his death. He's only days away from his earthly demise, and he wants to get in certain rebuke of the people that what might have been impossible at an earlier time. And so, of the 2 versions of the story, God told us to do it, or you guys insisted upon it, and it worked out really badly, which one is far better Musar? Well, the version of the story that emphasizes the human component, that you guys asked for it, and you never should have, because it was a terrible idea. So we don't need to, in the here and now, try to figure out exactly what happened, what component of it was a divine decree versus human initiative. The point is, in the retelling of the story years later, which one was more useful? Undoubtedly, the one that sidelines God and emphasizes flawed human decision-making. Okay, now let's go to the next piece of the puzzle, still in the first chapter. Devarim Perek Aleph, Pasuk Chaf Hey. Still on the story of the Meraglim. Vayikchu biyadam mi pri haaretz, vayoridu elenu. They took in their hand from the fruit of the land, and they brought it down to us. V'yashivu otanu davar. They gave us a report. And they said, Tova haaretz asher Hashem Elokeinu noten lanu. Good is the land that God is about to give us. So in the Deuteronomy version of the report by the Meraglim, there is no unpleasantness about Eretz Yisrael or any warning that it'll be impossible to conquer it because the other side are a bunch of giants and we're grasshoppers in their eyes. But in the Bamidbar version of the story, what does it actually say? Parak Yud Gimel Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Hanashim Ashaluim Amru, the people who, the bad spies said, Lo nuchal la'alot. We can't be successful in a military battle against the Canaanites. So what is it? What really happened? Was there a bad report where 10 out of the 12 spies said a very pessimistic thing about the prospects of the Israelites? The answer is, of course there was. Why is it missing from Devarim? Because the purpose of Devarim, again, is Musar. If we could blame the unwillingness of the people to be excited about the conquest of the land of Canaan, if we could blame that on 12 yichidim, 12 individuals who happen to have been the Meraglim, well, they all died already. They don't matter. And then there's no Musar to be had. But if you want to leave out the part where they say, oh, we can't win, and now pin the onus on the collective population of Israel, well, then there's your opportunity for Musar. You guys did something very bad. No, don't do it again. We're going to retell the story in a manner which facilitates ethical rebuke. Now let's go to a third divergence that again appears in the very first chapter of Devarim, verse 37. Moshe says about himself now, about why he is not going into the land of Canaan. Gam bi hitanaf Hashem biglalchem. Also against me raged God because of you guys. That you're not going to go there. So in the retelling of the story in Devarim, Moshe is saying that he doesn't enter the promised land because he too was punished together with the rest of the public over the sin of the spies. Now, is that consistent with the goings-on in Bamidbar? Absolutely not. In Bamidbar, in chapter 20, Pashat Chukat, we find that Hashem says to Moshe and Aaron, that the reason you're not going to go into the promised land is because you failed to sanctify the name of God in the episode with the rock, with the Rivah, that they were supposed to speak to the rock, to hit the rock, whatever the infraction was. And there's a lot of discussion in the Mefarshim about what that infraction really was, but that was the reason why they're not entering, not because of the story of the Meraglim, and that Moshe and Aaron were not caught up in that kind of punishment. So why then in the retelling does Moshe say, yeah, God also raged against me? The answer is because, again, the goal is Musar. if Moshe was exempted from the punishment imposed upon the general public, then the general public is not likely to want to listen to his belly aching about what they did wrong. But if he says, I'm with you in this suffering, that I also am going to die here because of what happened. I'm not distant and removed from everybody else's worries and travails, then they're more likely to listen. So we can try to explain away certain of the divergences, at least in the early parts of Devarim, on the basis of Moshe's need in a valedictory address to be an effective moralizer. Okay. But now let's go to certain legal differences that appear in the book of Devarim, where there's an obvious contradiction with some of the statements of the earlier books of the Torah. So one example is the clash between a line in the Ten Commandments that appears in Shemot and what appears in Devarim chapter 24. So in the Ten Commandments, we find the following. Lo tishtachaveh lahem v'lo ta'ovdem. So do not bow down to, do not worship the foreign gods. Ki anochi Hashem Elokecha ke'elkanah. I am a jealous God. Then poked avon avot al banim al shileshim aribaim lisonai, that God exacts punishment against 4 generations of descendants for the sins of the elder. So that sounds like the child, the grandchild, the great-grandchild of the evildoer or of the one who worshiped the false deity is going to pay a price, a this worldly price, for something that they personally didn't do wrong. Now, is that fair? Well, who's to say what's fair and what's not fair? I'm not going to pass moral judgments here. I'm only concerned with the Torah. What does the Torah say? And the Torah says, there's going to be some punishment for multiple generations for some infraction by the patriarch of the family. But then go to Devarim chapter 24. Very famously, one of the most morally pristine lines of the whole Bible. Lo yimtu avot al banim, uvanim lo yimtu al avot. That fathers will not die on the sons, or meaning for the sins of the sons, and sons will not die for the sins of the father. Ish bechet'o yumatu. Every man dies for his own sin. That there's not going to be any guilt by familial association. Well, in other civilizations, in other cultures, it was standard practice to have guilt by familial association. If somebody is a rebellious figure and they get caught and the regime is able to remain in control, the coup attempt is averted, what happens to the children of the insurrectionist? They die. Did they do anything wrong? They might have been totally not involved, but they get bludgeoned to death. It happens in every culture and every civilization. But the Torah is saying you don't do that. Only the people who acted inappropriately have to pay a price. So how do we reconcile the Ten Commandments version and the Devarim chapter 24 version? So for those of you who read my essays, I wrote a little bit about this 3-4 weeks ago on Parshat Chukat, on the issue of sending emissaries to Sichon Melech HaEmori, that the Torah says, in one instance, provoke them in battle. On the other hand, Moshe sends emissaries, divrei shalom, words of peace. And the Midrash goes on a long tangent and says very audaciously that what happened? Moshe found God's instructions morally objectionable and amended them because he thought he knew better. And what happens? He sends divrei shalom, peaceful emissaries to Sichon. They are rejected, of course, and there's a battle and the good guys win and the bad guys lose. But what happens in the long run? Hashem accepts the moral criticism supplied by Moshe and changes the laws of warfare that in Devarim later on, it says in chapter 20, V'karata elei shalom, that whenever you besiege a city, you have to offer terms of peace. Now, peaceful surrender, but terms of peace, that you don't engage in a genocidal battle without any possibility broached of a non-violent conclusion. So the Midrash explains that there are 3 examples where Moshe had some kind of squeamishness about the morality of God's instructions and changes them, and then God, in hindsight, says, Yashikoach, I agree with you, and going forward it'll be that way. So one of them is this issue of children dying for the sake of the father, or punishment imposed upon subsequent generations for the misdeeds of the family patriarch. That the initial version is the one in Shemot. Moshe doesn't like it very much. He petitions, for a change of that. Man dies only for his own sin. Ish becheto yumatu, and Hashem agrees, and so it's codified in Devarim. And not only is it codified in Devarim, it's also referenced in Malachim Beis, chapter 2, verse 6. What's the circumstance in that story? Well, the king of Yehuda, Amaziah, is punishing those who assassinated his father Yoash. But he only punished the assassins and did not punish the offspring of the assassins. Why not? Because the Torah says you're not allowed to. And which Torah? The Torah of Moshe. Not the Torah of God, the Torah of Moshe. So let's read the pasuk in Malachim Bet. But b'nei hamakim lo hemit. Kakatu b'trat Sefer Moshe, kasher tziva Hashem. So it's the Torah of Moshe as commanded by God. As commanded by God, that the sons don't die for the sins of the fathers. Okay, so it's pretty audacious stuff on the part of the Chazal to speak so boldly about Moshe confronting God and the morality of his commands. Okay, now let's go to another example of I wouldn't say contradictions between Devarim and other parts of the Torah, and it's not even an inconsistency so much as it is different material being presented when it might have been expected that the same material would be presented. What am I talking about? Obviously, there are two versions of the Ten Commandments. There's the version that appears in Parshat Yitro and the version that appears in Parshat Vayetchanan. So in the Parshat Yitro version, you have Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. In the Parshat Vayetchanan version, you have Shamor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. Remember versus safeguard. It's not a contradiction necessarily, but it's different. So how do we reconcile the two? Chazal have to do something about it. So the classic line is Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. We say it every Friday night in L'Chadodi, that they were said in the same utterance, that this is not different events, different time. In the same moment, you have two utterances. Now, is it possible for a human being to say two things simultaneously? Or for that matter, even for a human being to hear two things simultaneously? Impossible. And that's exactly why Chazal say that's what happened. To prove that the revelation was not ordinary communication, it was the kind of communication that could only happen from a divine source. That b'dibur echad, two things, a person couldn't do that. Only the Ribono Shel Olam could have done that. So that's Chazal's way of taking what seems to be a problematic aspect of the Bible's text and turning it on its head to be able to teach something theologically quite useful and productive. Okay, so, but what else? Let's look in the Gemara and Brachot, Daf Chaf Mebet. So Brachot 20b. Amar of Adabar Ahava, Nashim chayavot b'kiddush hayom devar Torah. Women are obligated in the law of Kiddush on Shabbos under Torah law. So the Gemara asks an obvious question. Why should that be true? Women are generally exempted from positive time-bound commandments. Mitzvat aseh shazman grama. And there's nothing more positive time-bound than saying a Kiddush on Shabbos, okay? It's positive, it's an affirmative thing. You have to say something, do something, and it's time-bound because you can only do it on Shabbos. You can't do it on Wednesday night, okay? So the Gemara responds, well, midrabanan. Maybe it's only rabbinically required. So the Rava says, no, it's not rabbinically required. It says Devar Torah, it's a Torah law. So the Gemara says, well, kol sheyeshno bezishmira, yeshno bezachira. Since Shamor and Zachor were said in one utterance, then anyone who is obligated in the prohibitive aspects of Shabbos, the Shamor, the safeguarding aspects, is also equally obligated in the performative aspects of Shabbos, the Zachor, the remembrance, which is fulfilled by way of the Kiddush. So what do we have here? Chazal took a problematic biblical passage, the inconsistency between Zachor and Shamor and utilized it to advance Shabbos observance, to say what? That don't think women are exempted because of some general rule of some halachic principle, that there's an exception, there's a Yotzei Min HaKlal here. And why is there the Yotzei Min HaKlal? Because the Shamor and the Zachor go together. If you have one, you have to have the other. And lo and behold, everybody, the men and the women alike, are involved in Kiddush. Okay, now let's go to what is, in my view, the most interesting of all the Deuteronomic passages, the sections in Sefer Devarim, where a seeming inconsistency with the earlier parts of the Torah could really get you into a lot of trouble, could trouble one's mind and lead one down a path that is theologically non-traditional, and we have to somehow rope you back in with a traditional answer. And I want to quote for that traditional answer, my hero, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, no relation to me, but I wish he was, because he's my hero, who was the greatest of the German Orthodox rabbis. He lived 1843 to 1921. He was the rector of the Berlin Rabbinical Seminary and was the posek of German Orthodoxy in his time. But his main contribution in the world of academics was that he defended against documentary hypothesis and all sorts of biblical criticism of the school of Wellhausen at a time when biblical criticism was in its heyday in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. He was a bulwark against that in favor of traditional interpretations of Torah. And so I want to recall his memory as a gadol, and let's examine how he defended the integrity of Sefer Devarim when it was under assault. So why was it under assault? The answer is Parshat Re'eh. Every year we read Parshat Re'eh. How many times? Not one time. We read it four times. When do we read Parshat Re'eh? Well, on the 8th day of Pesach, on the 2nd day of Shavuos, on Shmini Atzeres, and Parshat Re'eh. Okay, now we don't read the whole thing. We read the holiday section, Deuteronomy chapters 14 through 16, but especially chapter 16, which has a listing of the holiday calendar. Now, which holidays are mentioned in Devarim 16? Which Yamim Tovim? Are they allowed to unmute themselves? Can I get an answer from the crowd?
Yes, feel free to unmute.
Okay. So who knows? What holidays are mentioned in Devarim chapter 16? Silence. Okay, so it's Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The three pilgrimage festivals are mentioned in Devarim. What's not there? What other Yom Tovim are there? Rosh Hashanah, which is not called Rosh Hashanah in the Torah, it's called Yom Teruah, but whatever, the holiday on the first day of Tishrei, and Yom Kippur. Those holidays are not mentioned in the festival calendar of Devarim. So, what happened? In the late 19th century, the Bible critics, gave this answer. They said, oh, you know why it wasn't mentioned? Because the author of Devarim, D, in the JEPD documentary hypothesis, lived before P, the author of the priestly section of Leviticus 23, and so therefore the D author didn't know about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That the P came later, it was post-exilic, and so that's why it's not there. Now, obviously, from a traditional point of view, that's an unacceptable answer. But what is the answer? So David Tzvi Hoffman recognized that he had to come to the defense of the tradition, the Mosaic authorship of the Torah, the traditional conception of the Torah. And this was a very serious question. It required an answer. Why is Devarim so different when it comes to the holiday calendar? And he gave an answer that is an extraordinarily compelling answer. Sometimes the defense of the tradition, you could tell that it's apologetics. This is not apologetics. This is the correct answer. It's very clear that it's the correct answer. What does he say? That Devarim 16 was never intended as a full-fledged calendar of Jewish holidays, of Israelite holidays. It was only intended to tell people about those times of the year when it would be convenient for them to fulfill their religious obligation to eat the kinds of sacred foodstuffs that can only be eaten at the central place of worship. that Devarim is all about centralization of worship. The Makom Asher Yivchar L'Shakein Shemo Sham, the place that God chooses to rest His holy name. And the Torah obviously doesn't say where that is. We say it's Yerushalayim. The Shomronim could say it's Mount Gerizim somewhere in Samaria. But okay, for Jews, it's Yerushalayim. And that's where we go to eat what? Well, let's look at the source sheet. So for those who are keeping score at home, the source sheet, we're towards the bottom of the page. Devarim chapter 14, verse 23. V'achalta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, you shall eat before the Lord your God, the place that God chooses. Ma'asar degancha tiroshcha v'yitzarecha, uvchod b'karcha v'tzonecha. Your tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oils, and your firstlings of the flock and of the herd. So, what has to be eaten in Yerushalayim? Ma'aser sheni, the secondary tithe. The first tithe goes to the Levi. The second tithe you bring as a farmer your stuff to Jerusalem. What if you don't want to bring all the stuff because it's going to spoil and it's a long trip? You revert it onto money, and you take the money and use that money to buy foodstuffs in Yerushalayim. Okay? Or the animal offerings of the Bechor, of the firstling, you bring it to Jerusalem, it's a sacrifice, and you eat the meats. Okay? Now, not the Bechor, the Kohen eats the Bechor, but the Maser Behema, the animal tithe. So you can only do this in Jerusalem, but when are you going to go to Jerusalem? Right, I was in Yerushalayim 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago, on an interfaith clergy trip. But interfaith clergy trips didn't exist 2,000 years ago. Right? When did people go to Jerusalem? They went only when the pilgrimage festivals came around, and they were required to make an appearance before God. People didn't go on a trip to Jerusalem from the northern part of the country, or from the coastal plain, or from the far southern reaches on a random Tuesday in November. They went when it was required because of Rali ala Regel. So, when am I going to eat this stuff? The answer: on Pesach, on Shavuot, and on Sukkot. Not Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, because I'm probably not going to be there on those holidays. I'm going to be home davening with the high holiday machzor in my own shul. Okay, well, what evidence do we have from the text of this chapter that that's the intent of the chapter? Not to give a full text, a full telling of the holidays, but just when you're going to go to Jerusalem. The answer is, well, let's look at chapter 16, verse 2. Chapter 16, verse 2. V'zavachta Pesach la'Hashem Elokecha, you shall offer the Paschal lamb to the Lord your God, tzona bakar, v'makom asher yivchar l'shakein shemo sham, in the place that God chooses to rest His name. This chapter is telling us all the things that we need to do that we might not have assumed. You might have assumed that the Paschal offering can be brought in your own backyard. Why? Because the original Pesach was brought in the bait, in your own home, in Egypt. And you put blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. So a Jew in biblical times might have thought reasonably that the Paschal lamb every year is a household ritual in my own home, with my own doorpost, imitating the ways of Egypt. Comes along the Devarim to say, no, that's not what you do. You go to the central place of worship. But having gone there, how long do you have to be there? That's the key question. So when it comes to Sukkot and it comes to Shavuot, Devarim chapter 16 offers no divergence from the earlier holiday sections of the Torah. Numbers chapter 28 and 29, and Leviticus 23. Sukkot, 7 days, 7-day holiday. Shavuot, 1-day holiday. You stay for the full thing, you don't go home early. But Pesach, the Torah here allows you to go home early. It says, Ufanita baboker, v'halachta le'ohalecha. You get up in the morning, the next morning, after the first Yontif, and you go back to your homes. Why? Aren't you supposed to stay for the full week? Isn't it a mitzvah to do a full holiday? Answer: when it comes to Sukkot, the harvest is over. The agricultural work is complete. So you have no reason to rush home. There is nothing to be done. So stay a full week. The purpose of being in Jerusalem is to be spiritually nourished, to have some religious development during your time in the holy city. So we don't want you to leave early. And since you have no legitimate reason to go home, don't go home early. But Pesach, that's prime season of agricultural labor. So if a person goes for the pilgrimage and for the Paschal lamb, because it's a very important mitzvah, you get kares, you get a spiritual excision if you don't do it. Okay, but once that's over, I'm itching to get back to my farm. So the Torah says, you know what? If you really have to go home, so go home. But the holiday is not over. The holiday is not over. What do you still have to do? You still have to abstain from chametz for a full week. And you have to abide by the laws of Yom Tov on the seventh day of the holiday. Well, what does the Torah say in Devarim 16 about these laws? It says, Lo ye'ra'elecha se'or b'chol gevulcha shivat yamim. You shall not see any leaven in all your boundaries for 7 days. Why does it bother mentioning b'chol gevulcha? Precisely because the Torah is addressing this quirky, not so quirky case of someone who went on pilgrimage but has to run back home to do work and might have thought, my holiday's over and done with. I'll have peanut butter on rye when I get home. No, you can't do that. There still is a full week of the ban on leavened bread, not just in Jerusalem, but wherever you come from, b'chol gevulcha, even in the boondocks, in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. So that's one little hint that's the scenario we're talking about here. Another is that there's only one Yom Tov mentioned in the whole section where it says that you can't do malacha. Now, in Vayikra chapter 23, it tells us every Yom Tov. How many Yom Tovim are there in Judaism? First day Pesach, seventh day Pesach, 1 day Shavuos, first day Sukkot, eighth day Sukkot, 1 day Rosh Hashanah, and 1 day Yom Kippur. There are 7 days in Torah law of no malacha. Now Yom Kippur is different because it's absolutely no malacha, even cooking type malachot like Shabbos, but still 7 days of Yom Tov. Only one of those days is mentioned in Devarim chapter 16. Which one? The 7th day of Pesach. Why does it have to bother mentioning the 7th day of Pesach? Because we're talking about the guy who goes on pilgrimage, has to leave early, and might think Passover is over for me. Well, the answer is it's not. And you better not do any malacha on the 7th day of Yontif. 7th day of Pesach, it's a Yontif for you. That's why that one Yontif is singled out in this body of text. So a superficial glance at this chapter, you'd wonder, hey, why only the 7th day of Pesach is mentioned? Now you know. But there's one further contradiction between Devarim and elsewhere in the Torah that is so apparent and egregious that you have to have an answer for it. How many days does it say in the Torah you have to eat matzah? Well, in Shemot chapter 12, Shivat yamim matzot tochelu, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, matzot tochelu. What does it say in Devarim? Sheshet yamim tochal matzot. 6 days you shall eat matzah. 6 days? What happened to 7 days? How do you reconcile this? This is an obvious contradiction. So, Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman's explanation that Deuteronomy 16 is all about pilgrimage to the central place of worship, to the central shrine, and as an opportunity to eat sacrificial foodstuffs, and it's not a full holiday calendar. It's talking about people who are going to Jerusalem and people who may have to leave Jerusalem early for agricultural labor in the springtime season of Passover. Now I can explain why 6 days. You went for 1 day, a legitimate pilgrimage, with your Paschal sacrifice, with your Korban Chagiga, with your Korban Olas Re'iyah, Shalmei Chagiga. You did all the things you were supposed to do. And then you left. Well, guess what? 6 more days, it's meritorious, it's a mitzvah to eat matzah. The first day you did the right thing, but now there are 6 more days. don't forget about those days either. Now, in the Gemara explains it a little bit differently. The Gemara says that there's only a mitzvah to eat matzah on the night of the Seder. This is the famous Gezerah Shava, the application of one of the 13 hermeneutical principles that it says the word Chamisha Asar, 15 in reference to Passover, and it says Chamisha Asar in reference to Sukkot. So there's an analogous law that just as on Pesach, the only absolute requirement of matzah is on the first night, so too when it comes to Sukkot, the only absolute requirement of sitting in the sukkah is the first night, which is why if it rains, you have to wait, and the whole story, you must sit in the sukkah the first night, but else, the rest of the holiday, if you don't want to eat bread, you don't have to be in the sukkah. There are ways around the rules. So that's the comparison Pesach and Sukkot, that the only absolute requirement of matzah is ba'erev, on the night of the Seder, which is the first day of Pesach, the Tesvav Nisan, and the other 6 days are reshut, are discretionary. So 7 days it's a mitzvah to eat matzah, of which only one is an out-and-out obligation, chovah. The other are mitzvah, but in the category of reshut, of discretionary matters. So that's the Chazal's conventional way in the halachic realm of explaining the discrepancy. But I think Rabbi David Tzvi's explanation as an historical matter and as an analysis of how the Torah was being understood by its earliest readers is spot on. So these are some of the contradictions or seeming contradictions between Devarim and the rest of the Torah that require analysis and require some answer in order to sustain the traditional viewpoint about Devarim. But were the rabbis of the Talmud aware of the uniqueness of Devarim? That's a final question I'm going to pose to you tonight. And the answer is, some of them, yes. Some of them were keenly aware of how Devarim is different. So let's look at the last source on the page. This is Gemara in Brachot 21b. Rabbi Yehuda lo darish smuchin b'chol haTorah kul. So there's a concept in the Talmud of doresh smuchin, of expounding upon verses that have been juxtaposed, that appear next to each other in the text. And the fact that they're in such close proximity will tell you something about the law therein. So the classic example of smuchin in the Torah is the law of tzitzis and shatnez. What does it say in the Torah? Okay, Gidilim that you shall attach tassels to the four corners of your garment, and the connected pasuk is Lo tilbash shatnez semro pishtim yachdav. Thou shalt not wear shatnez. And what is shatnez? Wool and linen together. So how do the sages interpret this juxtaposition? That yes, the Jew is not allowed to wear a garment of a wool-linen combination, but the one exception to that is the mitzvah garment of tzitzit, of the talus, that the garment may very well be made of linen, which was the style of the time, but the tassels which were being attached to it are made out of blue-dyed wool. So the mitzvah is an exception to the general prohibition, that the mitzvah aseh is something that the way docha overrides the lo taseh. That's an example of dorish smuchin. But there are many other examples, not only in the Torah, but even in the Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Okay, so there are those among the Tanaim who rejected the idea of smuchin. They said it doesn't prove anything just because one verse is textually next to another one, doesn't prove anything at all. We read the Torah as is, each verse stands alone. But others did expound upon the smuchin. So Rabbi Yehuda, throughout the Torah, would not utilize a hermeneutical principle of smuchin. However, b'mishneh Torah darish, in the book of Devarim, he said, you're allowed to be darish smuchin. He would himself would do it. Why? Answer, because Devarim is qualitatively different from the rest of the Torah. That the text is arranged in a deliberate, in an intentional manner in Devarim, much more so than in the first four books. Why that should be, to be honest, it's a topic for a whole nother discussion and not for tonight. but I just wanted to show you that already in the literature of Chazal, they're very aware of the difference between Devarim and the other books of the Torah. And in terms of authorship of Devarim, is it Moshe versus is it the direct word of God? It's a very deep topic and not for now, but it may relate to why, from a legalistic point of view and an exegetical point of view, the rules were different for Devarim than they were for the rest of the Torah. Okay, so I'll take questions now on anything I've mentioned thus far. Questions? Are they allowed to unmute? Is it kosher? No questions?
Any questions for Rabbi Hoffman?
I think there's one in the chat.
Is it, the chat, okay. So what about Eli HaKohen's sons and the punishment for their future generations? So that's an interesting question. And the Gemara in Daf Yomi, not that long ago, maybe it was a month or two ago, although time passes very quickly, so maybe it was more than a month or two ago, addressed that point of, is the punishment of Eli's sons absolute, or are there ways around it? And so Abaye and Rava got different answers, and one was told if you do Talmud Torah, you'll circumvent the punishment of Eli's descendants. If you do Talmud Torah and Gemilos Chasadim, acts of loving kindness, that will counteract the punishment of Eli's descendants. I think that it's okay to accept the idea that divine punishment for some transgression of the ancient past can still happen in the here and now, but that God does it on his terms. What Devarim was saying is that an earthly court of Beis Din, of flesh and blood judges, can never impose punishment for somebody else's misdeed. Now, typically it wasn't even a court. It was typically some ruffian, some authoritarian monarch, some dictator who chops off heads left and right, including of people who were only tangentially associated by family connection with the malefactor. So that is a big, big no-no. Is there really a stira, a contradiction between what it says in Exodus chapter 20 in Aseres HaDibros and what it says in Devarim? To be honest, it's not really a contradiction. One is talking about what God does, one is talking about what people might do. And therefore, the question about Eli is not a question because it's what God does, and even God's doing can be undone by our righteousness. So I think that's the fair answer. Then what do you do with the Medrash that says there's a contradiction? The answer is sometimes the Medrash creates a contradiction that doesn't really exist, just to teach a theological point. And the theological point was that Moshe was ethically very attuned, and that the pasuk in Devarim is quite impressive. Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you. I do have one question. I don't know if it's related to what I asked before, but in terms of like Moshe sort of changing in the future what Hashem's dictated to us or commanded us.
Yeah.
How, like we learn also that Shlomo HaMelech in his day when he built the Beit HaMikdash, that the people didn't fast on Yom Kippur that year because they were dedicating. Right. So how, I mean, he didn't talk to God about that. He was brilliant. All right. But how did he do that?
So that question, the question of how he did it is interestingly off topic for tonight, but the answer is on topic.
Okay.
So
that's good. I asked the question.
Glad you asked the question. The question, how could he do it? Well, listen, people do all sorts of things that they think in the moment are religiously worthwhile, even if they know it runs afoul of some prior instruction. But on the whole, in their better judgment, they've made this decision. So Shlomo thinks that what's more important, the one-time celebration of the dedication of God's house, or the annual observance, including this year's observance of the Day of Atonement. And he makes a choice. But the Gemara says that that God offered a sign to indicate that Shlomo had made the right choice. So that's an example of post facto God giving a yasher koach to a biblical figure who takes a risk in doing something which is at odds with the initial instruction, which is consistent with what the midrash that I mentioned tonight says about God doing for Moshe, that he gave him a yasher koach on X, Y, or Z thing. And there are other examples that the Gemara talks about, that he broke the luchos and God gave him a yasher koach for breaking the luchos, or that he added one day to the preparatory period of Ma'amad Har Sinai before the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai, that there was supposed to be 3 days and he made a 4th day, and the revelation was delayed to the 7th of Sivan. So there are several examples in the literature of Chazal where they give like 3 or even 6 things that Moshe did that he gets a pat on the back after the fact. So Shlomo is another one of those cases. He gets a pat on the back after the fact.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? We're good to go.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Hoffman.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi Klinger. This was a pleasure. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Absolutely. It was exhilarating. Great. I love this was really wonderful. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us tonight as we now have a better understanding as we head into Sefer Devarim this coming Shabbos. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Rabbi Hoffman.
All right. Laila Tov. Take care.
Wishing
Thank you.
everybody a Laila Tov.
Thank you.
Thank you.